He gave up his seat in silence. She never asked for help. And 45 minutes later, the entire airline was thrown into chaos because one struggling father did something no one expected. This isn't just a story about a flight. It's about the power of seeing someone and choosing kindness anyway. If stories of quiet courage and unexpected miracles speak to your heart, you're in the right place. Subscribe now and stay with us. This is one story you won't want to miss. Now let's begin. Daniel Hayes hadn't expected the morning to begin with a miracle, but he'd learned long ago that miracles never looked like what you thought they would. They weren't lightning bolts or lottery tickets. Sometimes they were a half-full cup of gas station coffee and a pair of little arms clinging to your neck because the world outside was just too big. The world had been getting bigger ever since Melissa died. He tightened the worn-out buckle on Emma's tiny backpack and adjusted her knit hat handmade by a neighbor who used to check on them before she moved away. Emma looked up at him with the kind of trust that felt like a weight and a blessing all at once. "You ready, Munchkin?" he asked. Emma nodded solemnly, then sneezed. She was only 4, and her eyes carried too much understanding for a child that age. Daniel scooped her up, one arm beneath her legs, the other hugging her against his chest. His backpack, frayed at the seams, thudded lightly against his back as he pushed through the airport's revolving doors. The terminal buzzed with the artificial energy of travel announcement chimes, murmured frustrations, wheels on tile. Daniel took a deep breath. They had made it this far. The flight to Minnesota would be the final leg, and then maybe he could breathe again. Minnesota wasn't home, but his sister was there, and she had a guest room, a steady job, and the kind of stability Daniel could only dream of these days. He didn't like leaning on people, but he liked even less the thought of Emma missing meals. They reached the check-in counter and Daniel smiled at the young attendant. 2 for flight 728 to Minneapolis, economy saver under Hayes. She barely looked up. "You'll be in Group F. Seats have been pre-assigned. Here's your boarding pass." "Thank you," he said, taking the paper. She didn't answer. At security, Emma squirmed and cried when they asked to take her doll for inspection. Daniel apologized to the agents, mouthed a silent plea for patience, and gently calmed his daughter with stories about invisible dragons who only liked airports and little girls with brave hearts. By the time they reached the gate, Daniel was exhausted, but he didn't let it show. Emma had fallen asleep on his shoulder. He looked around at the rows of passengers and their expensive carry-ons, polished shoes, earbuds in. He was painfully aware of his scuffed boots, of how the handle on Emma's pink suitcase barely extended anymore. But they were here. That was enough. He found a seat near the corner, cradling Emma and watching the screen flash, on time. Just then, a small commotion near the boarding gate drew his attention. A woman stood near the first-class counter, mid-30s, olive-toned skin, dark hair, pulled back into a utilitarian braid. She wore a well-worn army jacket and carried a single olive-green duffel. Her boots, while clean, had the look of having marched too far for too long. "I'm sorry," the attendant said, voice clipped and mechanical, "but we can't verify the donation reservation. We need proper military documentation to process the upgrade." "But I didn't request it," the woman answered calmly. "It was arranged by a non-profit. They told me everything was confirmed." "I understand. But without proper ID, I have my discharge card. It's in the bag. She paused, frustration flickering beneath the surface. It's been a long month. Daniel recognized that tone, the fatigue behind pride, the effort to stay upright when the world was pushing you down. The attendant didn't budge. "I'm going to need you to step aside." People looked. Some whispered. 1 or 2 shook their heads. But no one stood. No one moved. Until Daniel did. He rose, gently lowered Emma into the seat and walked over. "Excuse me," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "Would it help if she took my seat?" The woman blinked. "Sir, I'm in economy, all the way in the back, probably sitting near the restroom." He smiled, but there was nothing bitter in it. Not exactly luxury. But if she's not welcome in first class for wearing a uniform, maybe someone should switch places. The attendant stared, uncertain how to respond. "I don't need anything fancy," Daniel added, glancing back at Emma. "I just need to get my daughter home safe." The woman's eyes softened, but her expression remained guarded. "You don't have to do this. I know," he said. "That's why I'm doing it." For a moment, the terminal seemed to hold its breath. Then a man in a sports coat pulled out his phone and began recording. Another whispered, "Did you see that someone clapped quietly at first? Then a second, and a third joined in." The attendant, flustered, finally nodded. "If both parties agree to switch, I can allow it." Daniel handed over his boarding pass, accepted the new one without looking at it. The woman took hers in silence. "Thank you," she said after a long pause. Her voice was low but steady. "Safe travels," Daniel replied, and meant it. He scooped Emma up again, kissed her hair, and followed the crowd to board. As he stepped through the jet bridge, his heart beat not with pride, but peace. He hadn't done something heroic. He'd just done something right. And that sometimes was enough to start a miracle. The scent of recycled air, stale pretzels, and too many perfumes greeted Daniel as he stepped into the cabin Emma cradled against his shoulder. The fluorescent lighting cast a dull, bluish glow over the cramped rows. His seat, now hers, was somewhere near the front. He glanced back at the last rows where the aisle narrowed and the engine hum grew louder. That was where he was headed. He gently shifted Emma's weight and made his way down the tight aisle, offering quiet apologies as he maneuvered past legs and elbows and backpacks that jutted out into his path. His own seat, 34E, was wedged between two strangers, already seated. The man by the window didn't glance up. The woman on the aisle looked annoyed that she'd have to stand. Daniel smiled politely. "Sorry, that's me." She stood, barely stepping aside as he slipped into the middle seat and gently nestled Emma into the crook of his arm. She stirred, but didn't wake. He laid her head against his chest, pulled the threadbare blanket over her tiny form, and exhaled slowly. This wasn't comfortable, but it was familiar. Claustrophobic, noisy, and smelling faintly of burned coffee. Yes, but also warm, solid, and his. This Daniel knew how to survive. Across the aisle, the man who'd filmed his interaction at the gate gave him a nod, half admiration, half curiosity. Daniel nodded back, then turned away. He didn't want a conversation. He didn't want a camera or a viral post. He wanted his daughter safe and his mind quiet for once. As the cabin doors closed, he allowed himself to glance toward the front. The woman, the soldier, was now seated by the window in first class. She sat stiffly back, straight, her duffel tucked neatly at her feet. She wasn't drinking champagne or reclining into leather luxury. Her hands were folded, resting on her knees, as though she was ready to stand and leave at a moment's notice. There was something about her posture that spoke louder than words, a tension that hadn't left her body, a readiness, even here. The engine roared to life. The plane rolled forward. Emma stirred again, this time with a soft whimper. Daniel ran his fingers through her hair, murmured, "Shh, it's okay, baby." She calmed, still asleep. As the plane lifted from the ground, his eyes closed briefly. He remembered the night Melissa died, the way her hand had felt in his cold, but holding on. The sound of Emma crying in the next room, and the impossible choice he'd had to make, stay with the woman he loved in her last breath, or run to their child. He'd chosen Emma. Melissa would have too. Since then, he'd been trying to piece together a life that felt more like a series of temporary fixes, duct tape, over leaking dreams. But there were moments like this one, where he felt the glue might hold. 40 minutes into the flight, Emma began to stir again, this time more restless. She wriggled in his lap, then sat up groggily and pressed her hands against her ears. Too loud, she mumbled. "I know, sweetie," Daniel said, lifting her gently. "You want some water?" She nodded. He flagged down a flight attendant who handed him a plastic cup without smiling. Daniel offered a quiet thank you and turned back to Emma, who took small sips. "Better." Emma nodded, then curled against his chest again. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why did you give your seat away?" "Daddy." Daniel hesitated. "Because someone needed it more than we did." She looked sad. "Yeah," he said. "I think she was." Emma was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Is she a hero?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked down the aisle again toward the front of the plane. The woman hadn't moved, still staring out the window as though the sky might give her answers she couldn't find on the ground. "I think she's trying to be," he finally said, "like a lot of us." Up in first class, the soldier felt eyes on her, even though none met hers. She could hear the whispered judgments. Why's she up here? Who gave her that seat? She pulled her duffel closer, fingers brushing against a small, worn medal in the side pocket. Army commendation. It meant something once. Now it just felt heavy. Her name was Sarah Monroe. She'd been Staff Sergeant Monroe for 6 years. Now she was just drifting. Discharged, unsure, untethered. She hadn't wanted the seat. A veteran charity had arranged it, hoping to give her a moment of rest. What they didn't understand was that you couldn't rest when your body still braced for impact at every loud sound, when the war followed you home in silence and shadows. And yet, that man, the father, he'd offered his seat without fanfare, without pity, just calm decency. That was rarer than gold these days. Sarah closed her eyes and breathed slowly. She hadn't thanked him properly. She'd barely looked at him. She regretted that. Back in row 34, Emma was asleep again. Daniel adjusted her weight and tried to stretch without disturbing her. The man next to him finally spoke. "That was a good thing you did," he said. Daniel glanced over. Didn't feel like much. It was. Not a lot of people step up anymore. Daniel offered a small smile. "I just did what I'd want someone to do for my daughter one day." The man nodded. The world could use more of that. Daniel didn't respond. He looked down at Emma's soft face, her breath steady. Her hands curled like little seashells against his chest. Maybe they were going to be okay. Maybe the small things, like a seat, a moment, a gesture, could still change something in this world. He didn't know that 45 minutes later, the world outside this cabin would explode with attention, outrage, and unexpected hope. But for now, the plane hummed steady. And somewhere near the front, a soldier exhaled for the first time in weeks. The plane leveled out above the clouds, that smooth, gliding quiet, settling over the cabin like a blanket. The kind of silence that wasn't really. Silence, air vents whirred, a child giggled a few rows back, ice clinked in plastic cups. But it was enough for people to lean back, scroll their phones, close their eyes, pretend they weren't miles above the earth. Daniel didn't close his eyes. He sat upright. Back aching from the lack of support, Emma now stretched across both of their laps. She slept like she trusted the world completely. That was the gift of childhood, and the burden of fatherhood to protect that trust from the truth as long as possible. He rubbed her back, gently staring ahead. What he'd done earlier, it hadn't been a decision so much as a reflex. There was something about the way that soldier stood, that quiet humiliation in her stance. She hadn't argued, hadn't protested, just accepted. Like she was used to being denied the things she'd earned. and that bothered him more than he'd expected. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft ping of the seatbelt sign going off and the low murmur of passengers settling into the rhythm of the flight. Somewhere near the front, Sarah Monroe sat still, but her mind was anything but quiet. Sarah stared out the window, but all she saw was memory. There'd been sand, and heat, and noise that never really ended. But worse than the noise had been the silence after the convoys stopped rolling, after the names stopped being called over radios, after her CO looked her in the eye and said, "You're going home, Sergeant." Only it didn't feel like home anymore. She shifted in her seat. The cushion was too soft, the air too sterile. She would have gladly taken a seat in the back. She hadn't needed charity. What she needed, she couldn't name. But that man, the father, he'd seen her. Not just the uniform, not just the trouble. He'd looked at her like she mattered. She'd wanted to say thank you, but words weren't her strength anymore. Silence had become her armor. A flight attendant stopped beside her with a tray. "Would you like a drink, ma'am?" Sarah hesitated. "Water." "Thanks." The attendant poured it without a smile. Sarah sipped and let her eyes drift to the other passengers. She noticed one man pointing his phone toward the rear of the plane. She squinted, then caught a glimpse of her own face on the screen part of a paused video. Her and Daniel at the gate. Her stomach turned. People were watching, recording, sharing. She didn't know whether to be angry or afraid. In the back of the plane, Daniel's phone buzzed on the tray table. He glanced down. "Man gives up, seat for soldier compassion still exists." It was a headline shared via text from a former co-worker. Underneath it, a thumbnail image of him at the gate. Emma in his arms. Sarah standing beside him. The post had thousands of likes, dozens of comments, some angry at the airline, some praising his heroism. Heroism. That wasn't the word he would have chosen. He looked at Emma, still peacefully asleep, unaware that her father was now a face on the internet. He didn't like that. He picked up the phone and texted back, "I didn't ask to be part of a story." The reply was immediate. "You didn't have to. The world needed one like this." Daniel set the phone face down and stared at the seat in front of him. He didn't do it for praise. He did it because something in him couldn't stand still and watch someone else be torn down. But now they were a symbol, and symbols came with weight. Up front, Sarah opened her phone. There were texts she hadn't expected. From former teammates, from old friends she hadn't heard from in months. "Just saw you in a video. That guy gave up his seat for you." "Whoa, is that you? The hero on the plane, Monroe? What did you do?" She didn't know how to respond. She didn't feel like a hero. And that man, he hadn't acted like one. He'd acted like a neighbor, a decent human being. Wasn't that supposed to be normal? The woman across the aisle leaned over. "Hey, I just wanted to say," that was really moving. "What he did. And the way you handled it. You've got dignity. My son just enlisted, and I hope someone like him runs into someone like you one day." Sarah blinked. "Thanks," she said softly. But the words felt foreign in her mouth. 45 minutes into the flight, the cabin lights dimmed. Passengers shifted in their seats. Somewhere behind them, someone sneezed, and a baby began to cry. And then the flight crew got the call. A viral video. A surge of online outrage. Veteran groups tagging the airline in furious posts. Media outlets requesting interviews with the single dad and the soldier. Sponsors threatening to pull funding from a partnership campaign due to the mishandling of a veteran. Chaos wasn't loud, not yet. But it was building quietly in digital waves. The lead flight attendant walked briskly to the cockpit, a phone in her hand, murmuring to the pilot. Sarah caught the tension in her eyes. Daniel felt it too. The plane's steady rhythm had shifted slightly, not in turbulence, but in energy. Passengers murmured. One woman asked, "Is something wrong?" The man who'd recorded the original video refreshed his feed and whispered, "It's blowing up." Emma stirred again. Daniel pulled her closer, instinctively protective. He didn't know what was coming, but it was coming fast. And none of them, especially not him or the woman in the army jacket, could have imagined what would happen when a simple act of kindness rippled out into a world desperate to feel something real. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're currently cruising at 32,000 feet. Weather conditions are smooth ahead, and we expect to arrive on time. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." The message was calm, routine. But inside the cabin, calm had started to fray. It began with whispers, low, urgent exchanges between passengers as more phones lit up. Then came the subtle stirrings, a woman craning her neck to see what her neighbor was watching, a man tapping away with furrowed brows, a teenager exclaiming softly, "Oh my God, it's going viral." The aisle seat beside Daniel shifted. The woman who had once looked annoyed now leaned in her phone aglow. "That's you," she said, without preamble. "You're on this video." Daniel blinked. "I am." She turned the screen so he could see. The video was grainy but unmistakable, him standing at the gate holding Emma, offering his seat to Sarah. The audio wasn't perfect, but the moment was clear. And the caption glared in bold, "Struggling single dad gives first-class seat to disrespected soldier. Humanity isn't dead." He stared at it, stunned. Below the video, comments poured in, faith in people restored. This man deserves recognition. Shame on that airline for how they treated her. God bless this father and soldier. Daniel's mouth went dry. "I just wanted to help," he murmured. The woman beside him smiled faintly. "And that's why it matters." In first class, Sarah had her phone switched to airplane mode. She didn't need to see it. She could feel it. The mood had shifted. Attendants moved more briskly, whispering into headsets. A woman across the aisle offered her a napkin and said something about "so brave." A teenage boy asked if he could take a selfie with her. Sarah declined politely but firmly. The last thing she wanted was attention. The gesture she had received, Daniel's simple kindness, was becoming a spectacle. And though she was grateful, something about it made her chest tighten. She closed her eyes and leaned her head back. For a moment, she was back in uniform boots on foreign soil, her CO telling her they'd lost their medic in the night. She'd volunteered to take over, no training, just instinct. She remembered the trembling hands she tried to stop from bleeding, the cries, in a language she barely understood, the silence, when the chopper never came. The medal in her bag meant survival, but it didn't mean peace. The lead flight attendant moved quickly, now knocking once before entering the cockpit. She spoke in a hushed tone to the captain, who was already glancing down at a flashing tablet screen. "Sir, the passenger video has reached over 10 million views. Military forums, news outlets, even public officials are weighing in. We're receiving non-stop pings from corporate. There's talk of media at the gate. They're demanding a statement." The captain rubbed his temple. "They want a statement from 30,000 feet. There's more. Someone posted the airline's internal policy manual, and it doesn't look good. It's trending under l'engagement vet dignity and dignidad seat for Sarah." The captain swore under his breath. "And the dad, back in 34E, no complaints, hasn't asked for a thing." He looked out the window, clouds stretching like white highways below. Then back at his co-pilot. "Get legal on the line, and alert Minneapolis ground staff. This flight's going to need a plan." Daniel adjusted Emma in his lap, trying to shield her from the energy crackling around them. Passengers whispered, peeked over seats. A flight attendant came by offering a juice box with an unusually tight smile. "Compliments of the captain," she said. Daniel accepted it cautiously. "Thanks." The man across the aisle leaned in. "Sir, if I may, are you okay with all this?" Daniel looked down at Emma, still sleeping soundly, unaware that her father was now a trending name. "I didn't do it to trend," he said quietly. "She just looked like she needed it more than I did." The man nodded, expression softening. "That's the kind of thing we used to value, before everything had to be recorded to count." Daniel let that sink in. He didn't regret his choice, but it felt strange being seen by millions for something so personal, so simple. Sarah stared at the seatback screen, its reflection catching her tired eyes. She couldn't stop thinking about Emma. That little girl, half asleep in her father's arms, had looked at her like she was someone safe. And Daniel, he hadn't looked at her like a problem to be solved. He'd looked at her like a person. It had been a long time since anyone did that. She reached for the small journal tucked in her duffel, flipped it open to a blank page, and began to write. "To the man in 34E, I never got to say this properly. Thank you. Not just for the seat, for seeing me." She paused, then wrote one more line. "If we ever meet again, coffee's on me." She tore the page, carefully folded it twice, and signaled a passing attendant. "Could you give this to the man who gave up his seat?" The attendant hesitated, then nodded. Moments later, Daniel felt a tap on his shoulder. "From 2A, the attendant said." He unfolded the note slowly. "Read the words twice." Then smiled a small private smile, not for the cameras or the crowd, just for him. High above the ground, turbulence nudged the plane gently. The passengers quieted. Headlines kept rolling. Tweets kept flying. But in the stillness of seat 34E, with Emma's breath steady against his chest and a note folded gently in his palm, Daniel felt something shift, not in the world, but inside him. He hadn't just given up a seat. He'd made space for something else entirely. It started with a cough. Emma stirred again, her body warm and twitchy in Daniel's lap. Her face, usually so serene in sleep, was now scrunched with discomfort. She coughed once, then again, a dry, rattling sound that made Daniel instinctively pull her closer. "Hey, baby," he whispered, brushing her hair off her forehead. "You okay?" Emma whimpered a soft, high sound that cut right through him. Her breathing sounded labored, now short, shallow puffs. She opened her eyes, dazed and glassy, and clutched at his shirt with both hands. "Daddy." "Hurts." Daniel's gut twisted. "Where, sweetheart?" "Where does it hurt?" "My chest," she breathed, barely audible. "Too tight." He sat upright, heart pounding. A few heads turned as her coughing grew louder. A flight attendant approached, alarm flickering in her eyes. "Is everything okay, sir?" "No," Daniel said quickly. "She's having trouble breathing. She has mild asthma. We haven't had an episode in months, but something's wrong. Do you have her inhaler?" Daniel shook his head. "It was in my coat. I think it's in the overhead bin." "I'll get it," the attendant said, already moving. Emma coughed again, more violently this time. Daniel cradled her, rocking slightly. "Just hold on, sweetheart. I've got you." People were watching now. The quiet tension in the plane gave way to worried murmurs. Daniel felt the weight of it pressing down, like every breath she struggled to take was being counted by everyone around them. Suddenly a voice from the aisle, "May I help?" He looked up and saw her, Sarah, kneeling beside their row. Her eyes locked on Emma's, then on Daniel. "I have training," she said softly. "Combat medic. Not certified civilian, but—" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Yes. Please." Sarah gently touched Emma's shoulder. "Hey there, little warrior. Can I see your hands?" Emma looked at her, scared, but mesmerized. Sarah's tone was calm, steady, the kind that cut through panic without raising volume. She checked Emma's fingers, pale slightly, bluish at the tips, then looked into her eyes. "Her airways are constricting," Sarah said, already pulling off her jacket. "We need to sit her up, elevate her slightly. I'll support her back." They maneuvered quickly, Daniel held Emma upright, while Sarah knelt behind them, pressing her jacket between the seat and Emma's spine for support. Sarah said, her voice a soft rhythm. "I want you to try something for me. Listen closely, okay?" Emma nodded weakly. "I'm going to whistle. Just a little sound. I want you to try to match it. Breathe out slowly like you're blowing through a straw." She pursed her lips and released a gentle, high-pitched whistle, steady and calming. Emma tried. The first attempt came out jagged, the second a little longer. By the third, it was working a slow exhale, shaky but controlled. "That's it," Sarah whispered. "You're doing great. Keep going. You're safe." Daniel felt tears rise, but he blinked them back. He didn't want to scare Emma. He just watched as this stranger, this soldier, brought his daughter back to calm with nothing but her breath and her presence. The attendant returned with the inhaler. Sarah administered. It counted the seconds and waited. Emma's breathing steadied, her fingers no longer trembling. "Better?" Sarah asked. Emma nodded, nestling into Daniel's chest again. "Thank you," Daniel said, his voice cracked. "I don't know how to." Sarah waved it off gently. "Don't. I was just in the right row." He looked at her. Really looked this time. Beneath the fatigue, the quiet reserve, there was a depth. He recognized someone who'd carried pain, but hadn't let it turn her bitter. Someone who'd seen too much and still chose kindness. "Where did you learn that trick?" he asked. The whistle, she smiled faintly. "My little brother. He had severe anxiety attacks. We grew up rough. Mom wasn't around much. I used to hum and whistle when he couldn't breathe." Daniel's throat tightened. "What happened to him?" "He died," she said softly. "Not in combat. Just life. Bad decisions. Wrong crowd. I couldn't save him." A long silence settled between them. "But you saved her?" Daniel said. Sarah's eyes shimmered. "Maybe I saved a piece of him too." The captain's voice came over the intercom again, this time less routine. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to acknowledge a medical response by one of our passengers. We are continuing our flight to Minneapolis as planned, and the young passenger is stable and resting. Our deepest thanks to those who stepped in." Applause broke out. Soft at first, then fuller. Daniel looked around, stunned. People were clapping. For Sarah? For Emma? For him? He wasn't sure. Sarah shifted, uncomfortable with the attention. "I don't want to be a story," she murmured. "Too late," Daniel said with a wry smile. She chuckled. "You either. I didn't even want to board this flight." Their eyes met, and for a moment the chaos, the cameras, the hashtags, they all faded. In their place was something simple, human. Emma stirred again, blinking sleepily. "Daddy? I'm here, baby." She looked at Sarah, recognition flickering. "The lady who whistles." Sarah smiled. "That's me." Emma reached out a tiny hand, placed it gently on Sarah's knee. "You're a hero," she said. Sarah swallowed hard. "Only if you are, too." As the plane continued its quiet journey across the sky, the noise outside, tweets, headlines, comments grew louder. But in row 34, with a child safe, a father humbled, and a soldier remembered, everything was still. Sometimes miracles didn't come in explosions or grand gestures. Sometimes they came in a whisper and a whistle. The descent began quietly. Outside, the early dusk of Minnesota stretched in long lavender bands across the horizon. Inside, however, the air felt electric, not with turbulence or tension, but with something harder to define. Expectation, confusion, the quiet hum before the unraveling. Daniel felt it before he understood it. The flight attendants were moving differently, more clipped, more coordinated. One of them had changed into a blazer. Another no longer smiled. They were preparing for something, but it wasn't landing. "Do you feel that?" Sarah asked, seated beside him now. Emma lay between them, her small hand still clutching Daniel's sleeve even in sleep. He nodded. Yeah. Something's shifted. His phone vibrated again. More messages, more missed calls from numbers he didn't know. One came from his old boss, another from a local reporter. There were texts from friends he hadn't spoken to in years. I saw you on the news. Proud of you. Man, your face is everywhere. You're trending worldwide, bro. Daniel set the phone down and stared out the window. He hadn't signed up for this. In the cockpit, the atmosphere was anything but routine. Minneapolis ground has just updated us, the captain said, turning to his co-pilot. Media crews are waiting. Not just local national. We've got CNN, MSNBC, a military journal, and a film crew from some human interest outfit called Uplift TV. The co-pilot whistled. They're that invested in one seat switch. It's not just the seat, the captain replied grimly. It's the soldier, the kid, the dad. The act. The fact that it was filmed. And what it says about who we are or who we want to be. He paused. We're also being advised to prepare for an unscheduled stop. The co-pilot blinked. A stop where Chicago or Des Moines. They're calling it a contingency measure in case security concerns escalate. Too much attention too fast. The younger man shook his head slowly. It's chaos, Captain. No, the captain corrected him, lips thin. It's a mirror. Sarah clutched the note Emma had scrawled in crayon, 5 shaky words on a napkin. You help me breathe better. It was tucked inside the front flap of her duffel, now just beside her discharge papers. It had been a long time since someone said anything that pure to her. Even longer since she believed it. She'd asked the flight attendant earlier not to announce her name. She didn't want to be called a hero. But that request, like her attempt at anonymity, had already been swallowed by the digital tide. Across the aisle, a woman leaned toward her. Ma'am, if you ever write a book or speak somewhere, I'd pay to listen. What you did. We need more people like you. Sarah forced a polite smile and looked down. She didn't feel like a public figure. She didn't feel brave. Mostly, she just felt exposed. Daniel noticed the change when the lead flight attendant approached their row, this time flanked by a second staff member and a man in a suit who wasn't there before. His name tag read, Corporate Liaison, Southwest Division. Mr. Hayes, he asked. Daniel tensed. Yes. We wanted to inform you of some developments before landing. There's significant media interest in your story. Ground operations have asked if you'd be willing to disembark through a private corridor to avoid disturbance. Daniel blinked. I didn't do anything special. The man smiled diplomatically. That's exactly why people care. Daniel hesitated. And her? He tilted his head towards Sarah. She'll be escorted with you. We've also contacted a representative from the Veterans Alliance. They'd like to speak with her. Daniel turned to Sarah, unsure what to say. She gave him a dry look. I'm not giving a speech, just so we're clear. Same, he replied, though my daughter might be tempted. They shared a laugh, soft, brief, the kind only people under the same kind of weight could share. The plane touched down smoothly, but the moment it did, the outside world stormed in. A collective buzz swept through the cabin. Phones dinged. Cameras flashed. Someone clapped. There were cheers. Actual cheers. Flight attendants tried to maintain order, but it was already too late. The name Daniel Hayes echoed up the aisle like a rumor-turned anthem. Someone shouted, Is the soldier here? And another, Thank you for your service. Sarah stiffened beside him. Daniel reached out instinctively, not to grab her, but to ground her. His fingers brushed her hand, and she didn't pull away. A young man leaned over his seat 2 rows ahead and said, You changed how I see people, man. An older woman whispered to Sarah. My husband died in Vietnam. I wish someone had stood up for him the way he couldn't for himself. Neither of them knew what to say. As they were escorted down the jet bridge, shielded from cameras by a line of uniformed staff, Emma stirred in Daniel's arms. "Where are we, Daddy?" "Somewhere noisy," he said with a tired smile. "But we'll be okay." Emma nodded sleepily. "The lady's still here." Sarah stepped closer. "Still here, kiddo." Emma reached a hand toward her, and Sarah took it without thinking. They stepped into the corridor together, father, daughter, soldier, facing a world that suddenly knew their names, their faces, their story, but not their hearts. That part was still unfolding. The hallway outside the jet bridge didn't feel like part of the airport. It felt like a press conference had collided with a rescue mission. Bright lights from camera crews, flashes from still photographers, and an oppressive wave of murmurs and questions met them like a heat wall. Daniel blinked against the light, tightening his hold on Emma, whose head now rested sleepily on his shoulder. Sarah stepped beside him, her hand still lightly wrapped around Emma's smaller one. Every step they took forward was like walking deeper into someone else's version of their story. "This way, please," said a calm voice to their left. A woman in a tailored black blazer with a badge that read, "Public Relations Director." Midwest Airlines gestured them toward a side passage cordoned off from the crowd. "We'll get you to the media room for a short statement. You don't need to say much, just a few words." Daniel's voice was flat. "We didn't ask for this." She offered a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That's exactly why people care." Security guards flanked them now, gentle but firm in their guidance. They passed passengers, who had stopped mid-stride to stare, several holding phones aloft. Some applauded softly as they walked by. Others whispered, "She's the one. That's the single dad. Bless them both." Daniel kept his eyes down. He didn't want to be the face of anything. He just wanted a quiet room and a few moments to breathe. Inside the media room, a makeshift podium had been set up, surrounded by cameras and a few dozen press members. The air smelled like too much cologne, cheap coffee, and ambition. A man in a navy suit greeted them with a handshake. "Mr. Hayes." "Ms. Monroe." "Thank you for agreeing to this." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "We didn't." The man chuckled as though she were joking, then gestured to a small seating area behind the podium. "We've kept it very brief, just a simple thank you message. Feel free to decline questions." Daniel sat with Emma on his lap, trying to focus. His mind felt foggy, like everything was moving one step faster than he could track. Sarah stood stiffly beside him, arms crossed, her duffel at her feet. After a brief hush, the cameras lit up again, and a woman from the airline stepped to the podium. "Good evening. Today we witnessed an extraordinary act of compassion that has touched hearts across the nation. A struggling single father gave up his seat in first class so that a veteran unrecognized and overlooked could be treated with the dignity she deserves. We thank them both. And now, if they're willing, a few words from Mr. Daniel Hayes." Daniel looked at Sarah. She gave the smallest of nods, not of permission, but of solidarity. He rose Emma, clinging to his arm, and walked slowly to the microphone. The lights were blinding, and he had to clear his throat twice before speaking. "I didn't do anything special," he began. "I saw someone being treated unfairly, and I did what I hoped someone would do for my daughter if she were in that seat someday." He glanced at Emma, who blinked sleepily under the lights. "I'm not a hero. I'm a dad. And I think being a good human being doesn't have to be complicated. You just act, even when no one's watching, especially then." A pause. Cameras clicked. "I hope we all remember that kindness is still free," he added. "And it matters." He turned away from the podium, almost forgetting the applause that followed. The MC turned to Sarah next. She shook her head. A moment of hesitation. Then a small voice. "Wait." Everyone turned. It was Emma. Still in Daniel's arms, she looked at Sarah and said softly into the mic, "She's a hero. She helped me breathe when I was scared. She whistles like music. And I like her. The room stilled. Sarah blinked fast once, twice, then stepped forward, took the mic gently. "I didn't ask for this attention," she said, her voice even. "And I don't want a medal. I've seen what medals are worth and what they cost." She looked at Daniel, then down at Emma. "But this girl reminded me today that the smallest things, breathing, feeling safe, being seen, those are the real victories. And sometimes they come from strangers who become something more." She left the sentence hanging, stepped back. The silence lingered longer than applause. Afterward, they were led through a private corridor to a quieter lounge, where bottled water sandwiches and a television played the headlines already airing their story. Daniel muted the screen. "I don't want to hear our names anymore tonight." Sarah nodded. "Me neither." Emma, now fully awake, sat between them with a juice box and a drawing pad given by one of the staff. She had already scribbled a crooked heart, and inside it wrote, "Daniel plus, Sarah plus, Emma Rentwash safe." Neither of them corrected it. Daniel leaned back, finally exhaling. "I have a sister here," he said. "Lives in St. Paul. We'll stay with her for a bit. Start over." Sarah looked down at her hands. "I don't know where I'm staying yet." He glanced at her. "I know a guest room that's probably empty." She smiled, small and surprised. "That sounds like the beginning of another story." Maybe he said. Or just the rest of this one. They sat quietly watching the girl between them color the world the way she saw it. Safe, connected, hopeful. No camera captured this moment. No headline broke it. But it was perhaps the most important part of the story. The part where healing began. The guest room in Daniel's sister's house smelled faintly of lavender and old books. It was small, just enough space for a twin bed, a desk with a chipped corner, and a nightstand, with a lamp that hummed when turned on. But to Daniel, it might as well have been a castle. Emma had claimed the bed, instantly burying herself in the blankets and whispering to her stuffed rabbit, like she was catching him up on everything he'd missed. Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, watching her, watching the way she could still find comfort in unfamiliar walls. Children were better at starting over than adults. They weren't afraid to begin again with nothing. Sarah was in the living room with his sister Claire, politely sipping the tea she'd been offered. She hadn't said yes to the guest room yet, but she hadn't said no either. Daniel stepped into the kitchen, his shoulders sagging slightly. He wasn't used to being still. Survival had made him restless. When you're constantly on the verge of losing your footing, you don't stand. You run. You move. You fix. He opened the fridge. It was full. Claire had gone grocery shopping before they arrived, as if expecting to feed not just him and Emma, but perhaps some part of his spirit that had gone hungry too long. He closed the fridge gently and leaned on the counter, listening to the soft murmur of voices from the living room. "You don't have to stay," Claire was saying to Sarah, "but you're welcome to." "No questions asked. I appreciate that," Sarah said. Her voice was quiet but firm. "You saved my niece's life." Sarah hesitated. "I did what I was trained to do." Claire's voice softened. "And I'm a mother. I know what it means when someone puts themselves between danger and your child. That goes beyond training." There was a pause. Then Sarah said, "I don't know how to stop moving yet. I've been on edge for so long I think stillness scares me more than danger." Daniel's breath caught. He knew that feeling too well. He stepped into the room just as Sarah stood. "I'm not here to take anything I didn't earn," she said. Claire smiled. "Then consider this earned." Sarah looked at Daniel. "She's kind. She always was the better one," Daniel said with a half smile. They all chuckled softly. Then Sarah added, "I'll stay a night. Maybe two." Daniel nodded. One step at a time. The next morning he woke early. Emma was still asleep, sprawled diagonally across the bed like a starfish. Daniel tucked the blanket around her, kissed her forehead, and stepped outside with a borrowed cup of coffee. The Minnesota morning was crisp sky, painted in soft blue and silver, the scent of dew and pine in the air. He sat on the porch steps, feeling something he hadn't in a long time permission to breathe. A moment later, the door creaked behind him. Sarah joined him, her hair pulled back, hands wrapped around her own mug. "You're up early," he said. "Habit," she replied. "Army teaches you that nothing good happens after sunrise if you're not ready for it." Daniel smiled. "What happens if you're not ready? You become someone else's cleanup job." He chuckled softly. Charming. They sat in silence for a few minutes, not needing to fill the space with talk. Finally, he asked, "What did you do before deployment?" He nodded. "I was studying to be a physical therapist. Then 9/11 happened. I was 17. I couldn't sit still after that." Daniel looked at her with quiet respect. "And after she exhaled, I floated. Jobs here and there. Never really stayed long. It's hard to settle when your nerves are still scanning for threats." Daniel nodded slowly. "I know that feeling. I thought maybe once I got Emma to safety, once we landed, it'd stop. But it hasn't. Not really." "You lost your wife," she said, not as a question. He glanced at her. "Yeah. Cancer. Quick and cruel. I'm sorry." "Me too." They sat again in silence, but this time it was different, shared, not awkward. "I'm thinking of looking for work," he said. "There's a diner a few blocks from here. Heard they need a cook." "You still remember how to cook," she teased. "I still burn less than I serve," he quipped. She smiled genuinely. "That's a skill set I can admire." Daniel looked at her carefully. "What about you?" "Any idea what comes next?" Sarah shrugged. "No. But maybe I stop running for a while. Maybe I try doing something small, consistent, like walking Emma to school, fixing something with my hands, making coffee instead of war." Daniel watched her face as she said it, noting the way her jaw unclenched slightly, the way her eyes didn't dart like they used to. "You're welcome here," he said softly. "Not just in the house. In whatever comes next." She looked at him, and for the first time since they met, she didn't look away. Later that afternoon, Claire handed Sarah a small set of keys. Front door, back door, and the mailbox. Sarah blinked. "You're giving me a key," Claire smiled. "I give keys to people who don't need to ask for them." That night, Sarah unpacked her duffel. For the first time in years, she folded her clothes into drawers instead of sleeping with them as a pillow. Daniel tucked Emma into bed and read her a story. And in a house that had been too quiet for too long, laughter filtered down the hallway. Not loud, not dramatic, but warm. But starting over wasn't a declaration, wasn't a bold moment or a headline. It was one mug of coffee, one drawer opened, one shared silence, and a guest room that slowly was becoming something else. Home. Autumn arrived in quiet shifts. One morning, the maple outside Claire's house turned red overnight, as if someone had spilled paint across the leaves while the world slept. The air grew cooler, more deliberate, and Emma began wearing scarves that dwarfed her tiny frame, most of them knitted by the neighbor across the street. Daniel had taken the cooking job at the local diner. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his again sizzling bacon at 6 a.m. regulars who tipped in loose change and stories. There was something grounding about it, something simple and dignified in making sure someone else's eggs came out right. Sarah, meanwhile, had slipped into the rhythm of the household with a quiet grace. She didn't talk about the war unless asked. She didn't talk about the media either, not the calls from veteran groups, the interview requests, or the foundation that wanted her to speak at a gala. She just lived. She walked Emma to school when Daniel had the early shift. She fixed the squeaky door in the hallway without fanfare. She started taking out the trash like it had always been her job. No one assigned her these things. She just belonged. But every now and then, Daniel would catch her staring at the back fence or standing still in the yard for a minute too long. Her eyes would drift far away back to places she didn't speak of, and when that happened, he knew not to ask. He'd just hand her a cup of tea and sit nearby until she came back. One Saturday, a postcard arrived in the mailbox. It was unsigned with no return address, just a picture of a quiet lakeside cafe and 5 simple words on the back, the starting place. Still waiting. Claire held it up, puzzled. Anyone know what this means? Daniel and Sarah exchanged a glance. Daniel took the card, slowly reading the scrawl. His thumb brushed the edge. Sarah's lips curved slightly. That's the place from the story. Daniel nodded. The cafe on the napkin, from her note. Claire raised an eyebrow. Who's her? Emma Daniel said with a soft smile. She wrote a napkin note on the plane called our seat, the starting place. Claire chuckled. She's 4 and already naming locations like a novelist. Sarah leaned over. It's her gift. Simplicity with meaning. Daniel flipped the postcard again. Do you think she wants to go back? Sarah said quietly. Not physically, symbolically, to where it all started. That afternoon they sat at the kitchen table with coffee mugs and a blank notebook. Claire brought out a local map. They weren't planning a trip, not exactly. They were sketching something different, something a little wild, a little hopeful. What if we built a place, Daniel suggested. Not a restaurant, not just a house, but something between. Sarah tilted her head. Like a community cafe or a drop-in kitchen, Claire added, catching on. Somewhere veterans, single parents, people in transition can find a meal, a seat, no forms, no questions. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she reached for the pen. What if it had a garden, something people can tend to? Grow things again. Daniel nodded, and a corner with books and crayons. And a sign at the door, Sarah murmured more to herself than them. The starting place. Claire clapped her hands once. Well, I do have a friend in zoning. They all laughed, but no one said it was impossible. A few days later, Daniel received an envelope from the Veterans Alliance. Inside was a letter, not asking for a speech or a fundraiser, but offering a grant. To be used at your discretion, it read. In support of community healing. Sarah looked at it for a long time before she spoke. They actually listened. Daniel placed a hand gently on hers. Maybe the world is more ready than we thought. She shook her head slightly. No. Maybe we're just ready to build. Than we were to survive. That evening, as dusk folded over the street, and Emma drew chalk stars on the driveway, Sarah sat on the front steps with Daniel beside her. She held the postcard between her fingers, still unsigned, still unclaimed. You think it was one of the passengers, she asked. Maybe Daniel replied. Or maybe it doesn't matter. She smiled, a message without a sender, like a blessing with no name. Daniel nodded, like a beginning. She looked at him, then really looked. You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't given up that seat all the time, he admitted. And I'd probably still be trying to fix a broken life in silence. You'd still be running. She inhaled deeply. But we stopped. We started. Emma ran up to them, then laughing, dusted in chalk and holding a bent dandelion. For you, she said, handing it to Sarah. Sarah took it carefully like it was a medal. Thank you. Emma leaned against her knee. Are we going to have a garden? Yes, Sarah said softly. And I'm going to teach you how to grow the loudest sunflowers. Emma's eyes widened. Sunflowers don't make noise? Sarah smiled. That's because you haven't heard them yet. Later, when the house was quiet, and Emma was asleep with one foot sticking out of the blanket, Daniel passed Sarah in the hallway. She held the postcard in one hand and a small hammer in the other. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the empty spot on the hallway wall. Daniel nodded. She tapped a small nail and gently hung the card and stepped back. There it was. A promise. A memory. A plan. A starting place. The sign wasn't fancy, just white paint over reclaimed barnwood. The letters slightly uneven, as if hand-lettered by someone who cared more about meaning than perfection. It read, "The starting place. Coffee. Quiet. Second chances." The cafe opened on a cold Thursday morning, barely announced, and wholly unadvertised. But within an hour, the tables were full. It wasn't just the coffee, though. Daniel's roasts were rich and warm, served in mismatched mugs that made people smile. It wasn't just the baked goods, either. Though Claire's lemon muffins seemed to disappear within minutes, it was the feeling. The moment you walked in, you knew you didn't need to be anything other than human. No one asked what you did, where you'd been, or why your eyes looked like they'd seen more than your years. There were no forms to fill, no clocks on the wall, and no music too loud to drown out thought. There was only space. Daniel stood behind the counter apron, dusty with flour-flipping pancakes, for a teenager who hadn't spoken all morning, but finally smiled when he saw whipped cream shaped like a heart. Sarah moved among the tables with the ease of someone who wasn't trying to be anything, just present. She poured refills, cleared plates, and stopped to kneel beside an elderly man who had been coming in every day just to sit near other people. He once told her, "This place reminds me I'm not forgotten." She didn't know his name yet, but she knew how he took his coffee. Emma, now 5 and full of questions, had her own spot, a tiny corner by the window, with crayons, a bird feeder view, and a sign that read, "Emma's Art Department." She'd taped her latest creation, a drawing of Daniel, Sarah, and herself, holding hands on the wall next to the sugar station. By noon, a man walked in, wearing a Marine Corps jacket, and silence like armor. Sarah saw it instantly. She met his eyes, nodded once, and pointed him toward the back booth, quiet out of the way next to the sun. No one else bothered him. She brought him a coffee. No charge, no small talk, just presence. Daniel noticed and said nothing. He'd learned that not all stories arrive ready to be told. Some just need somewhere to breathe. Later that afternoon, as the rush tapered off, Daniel found Sarah on the back steps, peeling labels off a box of donated canned goods. She looked peaceful. He sat beside her, their elbows brushing. "Pretty good first week," he said. She smiled without looking up. "We're not bankrupt yet." "That's a start." They sat in comfortable quiet, the kind that had taken months to grow into. Neither felt the need to fill space anymore. They had already filled it with choices, with trust, with something unnamed but steady. After a while, Sarah asked, "You remember that woman on the plane? The one who took the selfie with her latte and tried to tag me?" Daniel chuckled. "How could I forget?" "She sent a message to our website last night, said she's in town and wants to stop by." Daniel raised a brow. "You gonna let her? I told her she could come. But she'd have to wear an apron and bus tables." He laughed aloud, the sound surprising even himself. "You're becoming dangerous." "I was always dangerous," she said with a grin. "You're just catching up." He looked at her, then really looked. The sharpness in her posture had softened, but the strength was still there, layered now with something warmer. Not resignation, not detachment. Hope. That evening, the cafe closed early. Daniel turned the sign to "See you tomorrow," locked the front door, and dimmed the lights. Emma had already fallen asleep in the reading nook, with a book still open in her lap. Sarah was in the kitchen washing the last of the dishes. Daniel stepped in and quietly took the towel from her hand. "Go sit," he said. "I've got this." She started to protest, but then stopped. For once, she didn't argue. She walked to the table, sat down, and watched him. When he was done, he brought over 2 mugs of cocoa, sat across from her, and reached into his pocket. He pulled out the postcard, the one with the lake cafe, and the scrawled 5 words. She tilted her head. "You still carry that every day," he said. "It reminded me what I didn't even know I wanted." She looked down at her mug, and now he reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. "Now it reminds me what I don't want to lose." Sarah didn't answer right away, but her hand didn't move. Instead, she whispered, "What if I'm still figuring it out?" "So am I." She nodded. Then she whispered, "Okay." That single word settled between them like a seed. Something to grow. Slowly. Quietly. Strong. Later, as Daniel carried Emma home under the stars, her small arms looped around his neck. She whispered, "Did we build it, Daddy?" He smiled. "Build what?" "The place from the postcard." He looked over his shoulder at the cafe, its windows glowing warm in the early night. "Yeah," he said. "We did." The first snow of the season arrived like a secret, soft, unannounced, and utterly beautiful. Emma was the first to notice. She pressed her nose against the cafe window and squealed. "It's snowing," before racing outside in mismatched boots and a too-thin coat, arms outstretched, like she meant to catch the sky. Sarah followed close behind, with a heavier jacket in hand, calling after her with mock sternness. "You're going to freeze before the hot cocoa's even warm." Daniel watched from the doorway, a dish towel in one hand, heart quietly full. Snow had once meant hardship, leaky windows, cold nights another layer of struggle. But here now, it felt like something else. A fresh start wrapped in white. The cafe was closed that day, but the lights stayed on. A handwritten sign on the door read, "Private Event Community Night. Invite only." But everyone's invited. Inside, the long table had been pushed to the center. Mismatched chairs circled it like old friends, and the air smelled of roasted cinnamon gingerbread, and something sweet Daniel wouldn't admit was from a box mix. Sarah returned inside, brushing snow from her shoulders, cheeks flushed from cold and laughter. "She's making snow angels," she said. On the sidewalk, Daniel chuckled. "That kid can find joy in a puddle. Wonder where she gets it." He shrugged, pretending not to hear the compliment. But he felt it. He felt everything more deeply now, less like a man surviving, and more like one alive. Guests began to arrive slowly. Old faces, new ones. The teenager who used to sit in the back booth now brought his younger sister. The elderly man with the silent grief showed up with homemade cookies and a framed photograph of his wife. Even the woman from the plain latte selfie, and all walked in with a shy smile and 2 extra aprons. "Thought I'd earn my seat this time," she said. And Sarah, to everyone's surprise, hugged her. The evening was light laughter echoing against the cafe's brick walls, stories shared without pressure, silences respected. No speeches, no announcements, just presence. At one point, Emma dragged Sarah to the center of the room and declared, "Time for a toast." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You've been hanging out with Claire too much." Emma beamed. "I made a speech. Want to hear it?" Everyone turned. Sarah knelt beside her. Emma climbed up on a chair, hands on hips. "I just want to say thank you to the airplane, and the coffee, and the pancakes, and the lady who helps me breathe, and my dad, and the cafe, and snow." Laughter broke out warm and unforced. Daniel wiped his eyes behind a napkin. No one noticed except Sarah. "Beautiful speech," she said as she lifted Emma down. Emma nodded solemnly. "I'm a professional now." After the tables were cleared and candles blown out, Daniel stepped outside into the snow. It had thickened into gentle flurries, the kind that made the world quiet and new. Sarah joined him, her coat-zipped hands tucked in pockets. "Not a bad year," he said softly. She looked at him. "It started on a plane." "Middle seat row 34, he replied. "And it ends in a cafe built on a napkin." He turned to her. "Does it end here?" She didn't answer at first. Then, "No, I think this is the prologue." Daniel smiled. To what she stepped closer, her breath visible in the air between them. "To life after noise," she said. "To building instead of surviving. To second chances that don't feel borrowed." He nodded. "To miracles." She looked up at the snow falling silently around them. "No," she said. "To the people who make them." They stood that way for a while. Two people who had once walked into a flight, carrying nothing but exhaustion and silence, now rooted in something they never expected. Belonging. Weeks later, another postcard arrived. No return address, no signature, just a photograph of a sunlit garden with children laughing in the background. And one sentence: "The seeds are growing. So are we." Daniel pinned it to the wall beside the first one. Sarah added a tiny sunflower sticker beneath it. Emma taped up a drawing of herself, holding a watering can beside two smiling stick figures. And on the chalkboard, by the cafe door, in Sarah's neat handwriting, was a new quote for the week. "Kindness doesn't need witnesses, just courage." That winter, the cafe stayed open late most nights. Not for profit, not for publicity, but for the man who needed somewhere to cry without being alone. For the woman who wanted to bake again. For the teenage girl who found her voice reading aloud to Emma. For Daniel, who rediscovered what it meant to breathe without guilt. And for Sarah, who finally stopped listening for explosions and started listening for laughter. They never became famous again. The headlines moved on, and the internet chased its next miracle. But inside the walls of the starting place, the real miracle kept happening. Every single day. And that was their beginning. A single seat, a quiet act of kindness, and two lives stitched back together, not by noise, but by grace. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to know. Where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below. We read everyone, and it means more than you know. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories of love, hope, and second chances, feel free to subscribe. We're building a small corner of the internet where kindness still matters. From all of us here, thank you for spending time with us today. Your presence truly makes this space warmer.